and you shall rejoice on your holiday, and you shall be only happy. Those words from the Torah refer to the holiday of Sukkot. Rosh Hashana begins a journey on the Hebrew calendar that's 3 weeks long to the end of Sukkot, to Simchat Torah. Sukkot, the rabbis call Hechag, the holiday, the consummate holiday. In our Amida prayers, we will refer to it as Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. And yet, it was not such an easy journey. Sukkot celebrates the 40 years in the desert and the dwelling in those flimsy huts. In the course of those 40 years, there were 14,600 nights under the stars, putting up tents, 43,000 plus meals to prepare in the desert, dishes to wash, clothes to clean. It was a journey of 40 years in which there were many quarrels between the people and Moses, many times that Moses despaired. No less than God threatened more than once to wipe them out. Am kashay orevhu. They are a stiff-necked people. That journey through the desert we celebrate on Sukkot, and we refer to it as our time of rejoicing, which calls into question, what is happiness? Happiness, part 2. The word happiness comes from the Old Norse, Icelandic, hap. Hap means luck. It's found in other words like happenstance. It's what happens to you. Our folk tradition, in Yiddish we say, if you have luck, you have everything. And yet, the Talmud would say, don't depend on luck, which doesn't stop us from singing Siman Tov and Mazel Tov, Siman Tov, may you have good luck. And at the same time, it would seem that luck alone is insufficient. Indeed, all the definitions of happiness on some level are paradoxical. Yes, you need luck, but it can't be just luck. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the great teacher of German Jewish life, said that Sameach sounds like Semach, for the source of happiness is growth. That when one learns, one is happy. And indeed it is true that to grow intellectually, to learn is to be happy. And yet, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes 1:18, V'yosif yet da'at yosif mach'ov. One who increases knowledge increases pain. And that's also true. You have the image from, if you will, from Woody Allen's film, Annie Hall, the couple walking down the street, and he says, you look so happy as a couple. What is it that you think about that makes you so happy? And he says, I don't think about anything. And to which he says, me too. To have thoughts, to be aware, to read the newspaper is not necessarily to feel happy. And yet, that is also true. Happiness is semach, is growth, and yet not. I was interviewing, as I shared yesterday, a number of people about what is happiness for you. A 17-year-old said to me, I prefer contentment as a word, as a striving to happiness, because happiness feels fleeting. Contentment sounds more stable. I feel content, he said, when I think of my grandfather who died 4 months ago. When I think of him, I feel sad, but I feel content. Because when I think of him, I feel connected, and I feel his love. So although I'm sad, I'm also contented because I feel present, fully present. And indeed, in our tradition, there's a similar definition of happiness. In the Talmud in Eruvin, in 13b, there's a discussion about how one is to respond when one hears bad news. And the rabbis say you are to respond, Rabbah says, to bad news the way with good news, besimcha, which we usually translate as happiness. And Rashi comments, what is simcha in the context of hearing bad news? Belevav shalem, with a fullness of heart. To have a fullness of heart, to be fully present, is to be besimcha. And yet, that's also incomplete. I would have said to this 17-year-old, as I did, your response is extraordinarily insightful, but it's also incomplete. A story, 1845. Phineas Gage is a foreman on a railroad. He's working in the Midwest when there's a big explosion. A 1-foot pipe flies through the air, enters under his chin, goes straight through, giving him a lobotomy. Frontal lobe goes out with the pipe. He falls to the ground. He gets up. He says to the co-workers, I'm okay. I got to see a doctor, but I'm okay. And he walks to the next town with the guy next to him. He lives the next 12 years of his life more or less fine. And doctors, in light of the experience of Phineas Gage, begin to think, you really don't need your frontal lobe. In fact, in the 1930s and 1940s, lobotomies are actively done for people who are very anxious or deeply depressed. Because what they find when they do a lobotomy is that a person has very little anxiety. It reduces anxiety, and they're very functional. Not very functional, they're largely functional in that if you ask them to describe what's going on around them, they can answer basic questions, but without the anxiety. In fact, in 1949, the Nobel Prize for Medicine went to a man, Dr. Egos Munoz, for his work on lobotomies as a solution to anxiety. But as lobotomies became more common, they found there was a problem. If you interview a person without a frontal lobe, which is what makes us distinctly human, they can describe everything around them. They are fully present, but they have no future tense. If you say to somebody who's had a lobotomy, what do you plan to do tomorrow? They more or less cannot go there. It's like talking about infinity. It's not a category. The ability to look forward, to plan, and with that, to have anxiety, is distinctly human. And so, what is happiness? Yes, it is to be belevav shalem, with a fullness of heart that is understood as even holding sad thoughts in the moment as well as happy thoughts, to be fully present. But it's more too. It's the ability to not only be in the present, but to be in the future as well. Happiness is elusive, as you can see in trying to find a definition. For happiness by its nature is paradoxical. The holiday of Sukkot is a holiday in which we say, Zman Simchatenu. This is a time of rejoicing. I'd like to share some ways in which Sukkot as a holiday can give us insight into what it means to be happy. First, Sukkot is about a journey in which the people never reach their destination. The Kotzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, who lived about the same time as Abraham Lincoln, he, in parsing a verse from Deuteronomy, emphasized that the seeking is the finding, that it is being on the journey itself toward God. It is the journey that is the source of obtaining one's goal. The first thing that we learn from Sukkot is that how we travel makes a difference and to a large degree defines how happy we are. That to some degree was yesterday's sermon. What we value in our lives today, what we don't take for granted but we hold as dear as we travel toward the future, defines the quality to a great degree of our lives. But attendant to that is the importance of having a goal. Happiness, what makes us distinctly human, is to be future-oriented. In order to be content, one must feel as if one has a purpose. You say to somebody, "Don't tell me how the movie ends. It'll ruin it for me." Because to know where a movie is going, to know the plot, is to know in many ways the punchline, but more, is to know the essence of everything that comes before. For ultimately, the goal ties together everything before. As a people, we do live with a goal. It's the goal of a messianic era. The goal that one day all our efforts in partnership with God will enable a healing in the world. Viktor Frankl, the great psychologist who survived the concentration camps, said that when he talked to those who survived and the Muslims who often chose to throw themselves against the barbed wire, that the difference between those who kept moving forward and those who could not was a sense that there was a forward to move toward, that there was a sense of purpose, a sense of hope, a sense of a destiny on the other side. To live this life with simcha is to tie ourselves to a personal vision of a better tomorrow, to live with goals, to live with meaning, and on a grander scale, to live with the sense that the world too is progressing. To live with happiness is also to remember always not only what your immediate goal is, but what the higher goal is. Rabbi Abraham Twersky says his father used to tell him the story of a young prince who was misbehaving in the palace, and his father sent him away in order to make amends. And so he wandered and found the open fields. It was harvest time, and he was offered a job working at harvest. And as he worked, he saw that the other workers knew how to make themselves a sukkah, knew how to make themselves a little hut to keep them in the shade. Try as he might, he had no experience with building. His sukkah kept falling down. He had no protection. One day, the young prince went out onto the road, for there were many people gathered there. The word was that the king was going to be driving by. And if you took a note and you wrote down a request and you threw it into the king's carriage and it landed safely, the king, the custom was, would grant your request. And so the young prince wrote on his note a request. And sure enough, he threw it and it landed in the carriage. As his father opened it up, he recognized his son's handwriting. "Dear king," it said, "please provide a carpenter to build me a better hut." And his father began to cry. "This is the writing of my son. How quickly he forgot who he was. How quickly he forgot his potential." He could have said, "Dear king, please invite me back to the castle." And I would have. A preacher, Philip Brooks, wrote, and he said that for most of us, our lives will not be problemed by having committed a crime. Most of us will not have done that and have undermined our happiness. Most of us will not be so incapacitated in health that we won't be able to enjoy life. Philip Brooks said, "The great challenge is remembering who you are and your possibilities, for we too easily fall into the habits of where we are." Sukkot reminds us that we're on a journey to a promised land. It's not a promised land they ever get to. Not unlike happiness, holding it is never achieved. It's only pursued. And yet, having a goal is what enables us to move forward. Having a higher goal, the goal of helping mend this world, of being God's partner, and gives our lives greater meaning each day and makes a difference. On Sukkot, we have guests who come in to visit with us. Those guests are reminders of our past. They're Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I deal in counseling a great deal with people who have a great deal of pain in their past. In some cases, it's a loss of a child. In other times, it's a loss of a spouse. Each case is distinctive. Each loss, particularly when it was unexpected, is traumatic. And what I have learned about being happy is, first of all, it's presumptuous to tell anybody else how and when to heal. People have different rhythms and different needs. But I will tell you one thing I have learned, and that is, if you shut down and create barriers on going inward in dealing with losses of the past, you also block yourselves out in experiencing joy too. I was talking to someone just last week about a suicide, and she shared that she just doesn't deal with it. And again, it's not somebody from our community, which is why I mention it. It's not something I can at all understand and fathom in terms of the pain. It's an extreme. It is the extreme of healing because there are so many unanswered questions. And yet what I know is that by failing to go inward, that hole, that sense of loss becomes dominant, controls that inner landscape. When you go inward in dealing with losses, which we all have of varying degrees of severity, what we're able to gain is the capacity to negotiate the circumference, the location of our losses. By being able to know where that hole is within us, we're able to negotiate it. And when we're able to negotiate it, as a metaphor, we're able to look up and get a bigger sense of an inner landscape that includes much more than just loss. And we're also, because we move, particularly in the beginning, so carefully on the inside, able to feel the ground under our feet, both the pebbles that hurt as well as the soft grass that feels so soothing. To be able to go inward is to be able to live more fully, more spontaneously, with less fear of the potential holes of falling in on the inside. Particularly with big losses, it's best to go inward with a guide. Often that guide is somebody else who's had a similar loss. Someone to reassure you, to hold your hand, to say it's okay, you won't fall in. It might feel like it might feel like a darkness with which you're going to enter and never be able to be extracted. But I've been there. I've walked around it. I didn't fall in, and you can too. The more extreme the quality of the loss, the more important it is to have a support grief group who's been in that place before. It also helps to have a therapist. Therapists are people who are trained, and more than training, who have the experience of working with inner pain to be guides. We must do the work. No one can do it for us. A therapist does not take over our lives. I know good people who are afraid to go to see a therapist because they're afraid they'll be controlled. That's not what a good therapist would do. A good therapist allows you to walk more safely, to learn to landscape that inside to allow you to be more free. There's another piece of that journey of the Sukkah, besides welcoming in the past of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob to be with us in our Sukkah. And that is, we acknowledge in our Sukkah that we are forgivable. For the people in that walk through the desert were constantly messing up. And it was Moses who had to forgive him. It was God who had to forgive him, all the more so after the golden calf, and he did. And they had to forgive each other. Here's another thing that I see happening with loss that is such an impediment to a levav shalem, to the fullness of heart. As an expression of love, people will say, I wish my loved one was still here. Then they'll say, and it's again, the saying is a vessel for a feeling. The feeling continues to move. And the next phase of the feeling is, I wish I had done something to have prevented that loss, to prevented them dying when they did. And then, I wish I had done something turns to, I could have done something. That's not, again, a rational statement. It's a statement of affection, of desire that they were still here. And then the I could have done something becomes, I should have done something. And soon, the emotion continues to be, damn it, why didn't I do anything? I'm no good. I was lazy. I was oblivious. I was uncaring. And the person begins to beat on themselves. And I see it repeatedly as a process. Cognitive therapy is one of the areas of growing psychology which says that a great deal of our unhappiness comes from the voices in our head that often beats on us that are irrational. Sometimes these are voices from our childhood. Sometimes they're from somebody we didn't get along with. Often they're generated by emotional longing. And the technique of cognitive therapy is to either write down the thoughts that are troubling you or beating you, and then rationally to look at them and say, is it true? Is it really true that I could have done something? Particularly, not now. Now I know more, but then. Did I know enough then? Did the doctors know enough then that they could have done something? And to be able to look rationally at the feelings that we beat ourselves with is to be able to reclaim a sense of grounding, a sense of being reasonable, the ability to separate out negative feelings from reality. The story is told of the Chafetz Chaim in this regard. The Chafetz Chaim lived in Poland in the 19th century, was a great writer of Jewish law, the Mishnah Brura, but also the writer of a work to which his name is given, the Chafetz Chaim. Mi ha'isha Chafetz Chaim. Who is the man who desires life, it says in Psalms, the one who guards his tongue. He was the master of piety, of guarding his tongue. A visitor came to his town. It was early in the morning and the Chafetz Chaim was out on a stroll. And the visitor said, "Tell me, do you happen to know where the Chafetz Chaim lives? That pious, learned rabbi?" And he says, "Yes, I do, and I can give you directions. But I happen to know he's not so pious and he's not so learned." At which point, this man who had traveled so far with such passion punched the Chafetz Chaim. "How dare you speak about him that way, that pious rabbi?" A crowd gathered around the street helping up the elderly rabbi. And the rabbi says, "No, it's fine." They were starting to grab the guy. He says, "No, it's fine. He's right to have punched me. I was speaking ill of myself. To speak ill of yourself is as bad as speaking ill of somebody else." But we do it so often. We slam ourselves. Happiness is developing the inner awareness of what those voices are with which we put ourselves down. For to be happy is to learn to praise and honor ourselves too, the way we would a loved one. And so we sit in the Sukkah, a journey that had purpose, even though we didn't get there. A sense of having visitors, ushpizin, that we bring in from our past, that we have learned to embrace. A sense of forgiveness. There's another dimension to forgiveness. And that is on this journey, we're reminded of the need to forgive those who have hurt us. Anger that we hold within us is often justified. There are people who we love who have not acted lovingly toward us. It's particularly the people that we care about who've been insensitive, that infuriated us. And we hold that anger ready to set them on fire when we can. It's as if we're holding a torch, getting ready to throw it at them. And while we're holding the torch, we catch on fire ourselves and we are singed. Forgiveness is what we learned on that trip through the desert. And it's what Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur are about. The ability to let go, to free ourselves of our anger at others. When we hold anger, we become much more limited in who and what we can be. And so we're called on this journey from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur and in the Sukkah to be aware of whom we feel anger toward and to, if we can, let it go. It doesn't mean to be victimized. There are some wrongs that you need not let go, but there aren't very many. Usually we hold the anger because it gives us a sense of power, a sense of control, a sense of righteous indignation. Damn them. And when you hold the damn them, you feel you're on your horse, but it isn't going anywhere. We may not get where we're going on Sukkot, but at least we're getting someplace. And it's harder to travel. Forgiveness, tshuva, is the enterprise we're now engaged in. It's to be continued all the way to Hoshana Rabbah, to the 5th day of Sukkot, because it's not easy to let go. Not only are we asking God for forgiveness, but we're called to imitate God. If we would wish God to forgive us for our stupidities, for our indiscretions, for our compulsive acts, for our slips of the tongue, then we must and are asked to see others through God's eyes, which is the last part. To be happy is like getting to the promised land. You get to the edge and you start over. You don't own it. But fundamentally, the journey that we celebrate on Sukkot was a journey in which we had Moshe Rabbeinu at our head, Moses our teacher. And what was it that Moses was trying to teach us? To see the world through God's eyes. That's what the Torah is to a great degree. And that's what we do at the end of Sukkot. We take the Torah and we dance. Because the Torah for us embodies that yearning to be close to God, and its words reflect our people's attempt to see the world through God's eyes. When you see the world through God's eyes, you see it from its broadest perspective, in which all the little things fall away. To see the world through God's eyes is to be reminded of our core values and what really matters. And so on Sukkot, we embrace Torah, and with it, the call to be God's partners, God's servants, to fear God, to love God, and to see the world through God's eyes. To see the world through God's eyes is to see the divine image in every other person. That's not a rational statement. That's a statement of faith, a statement of belief. And that's why in Sukkot it is the custom that there's always one wall that's open, an entire wall of this temporary dwelling to allow in guests. It's not a Sukkot meal without strangers. To be able to see the world around us, not as a world of strangers, but as our collective home. To see the world through God's eyes, as each person is God's child too, is ultimately to feel at home in the world. To be at home in the world is to feel joy. When we sit in our sukkah, we're reminded that our world is fragile, that happiness is fragile too. And simultaneously and paradoxically, we're reminded we're also very strong. There's a great deal of stability. In our sukkah, we look up and we see the stars. That's required. The schach has to be designed in a way that you can look up and see order in the world. Easier to see looking up than looking around. And that's what we say, Oseh Shalom b'mromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. As you have made order in the heavens above, so may there be order in the world beneath. As we sit in the sukkah, we gather in the bounty of a harvest holiday. We know that the journey that we're still on, but it's a journey with purpose. It's a journey toward a promised land. We don't travel alone. We travel as part of a caring community, not only as a Jewish people, but as God's children. And so on Sukkot, we take the lulav and etrog in hand, and we shake it in all directions. Shaking it in all directions to say that God is everywhere. And the rabbis comment that the lulav and etrog represent our body, the etrog our heart, the lulav our spine, our lips, our eyes. We take the four species and we pull them together, saying that on this day of Sukkot, we experience wholeness, we experience happiness, we experience the awareness that happiness is luck and not just luck, that happiness is growth, but not just growth, that happiness is being in the present, but also living with an eye to the future. We, on Rosh Hashana, begin that journey that begins with self-reflection, that hopefully will allow us to be actors in the world with hammer in hand. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, life is a journey, and the quality of our lives is the quality of the journey itself. The destination is before us, which provides us hope. It's a journey we acknowledge is fraught with difficulties, both that we hold on to from the past, that we experience in the present, and that we anticipate in our future. May we learn to negotiate our interior with all the wounds of the past, thereby bringing in healing. May we live in the present knowing that there is much to celebrate, much bounty. And may we look forward through your eyes, acknowledging a world of wholeness, a world of goodness, a world worthy of celebration. And may we celebrate each day. Amen.